Welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this presentation, we want to talk about the Wave Sheaf and the Pentecost. And this is going to be a subset of the information that you can find in the full Torah calendar study. If you want to read the full study, I encourage you to go to nazareneisrael.org, and you can read the study free on the pages online, or you can download a PDF copy in English, Spanish, or German. Or you can, if you prefer, you can also purchase a paperback copy from Amazon.com at our cost. But as we discuss in the Torah calendar study, there are 7 main festivals in Scripture for Israelites. Now, the first 3 of these festivals are the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Pentecost. And together, these form what are called the spring feasts. But the timing of the spring feasts basically rotates around the ripening of the barley and the visible sighting of the first crescent sliver of the new moon in the land of Israel. So this is different than how the rabbis do it, but what we want to do is we want to talk about what Scripture says to do, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the rabbis do later on in this presentation, and we also discuss it in the Torah calendar study. So in the spring, what happens is that when the barley begins to ripen, it reaches a state of maturity known as aviv. Basically, it means almost ripe, or a week or 2 weeks short of being ripe. And then when the barley has been seen in the aviv state, just short of being ripe, then we look for the first crescent sliver of the new moon. And so when we see both aviv barley and the first crescent sliver of the new moon in the land of Israel, that's when we declare Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year. Now, the rabbis declare Rosh Hashanah in the fall. We're not going to concern ourselves with that. If you want to, you can read about that in the Torah calendar study. But when we reach Rosh Hashanah, the Passover is then 2 weeks or 14 days later, and that can take place on any day of the week. The Rosh Hashanah, or the Passover, also can fall on the first day, second day, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or even the 7th day of the week. Now, and whatever day the Passover begins on, the first day of unleavened bread would be the next day, and the second day of unleavened bread would be the day after that. And those dates, the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, they all shift together. Now, the thing that's important to remember is that the Omer is a completely separate count. So just like the Feast of Unleavened Bread pertains to the Passover, the Omer is a separate count that pertains to the Pentecost. Now, the Omer is always, no matter what day of the week the Passover falls on, and this is different than the rabbinical model, the Omer, according to Scripture, is always going to be presented on the first day of the week that follows the Passover week. And we'll give some chart examples of that in just a moment. So let's go to what we'd like to do, though, is let's go to the commandments. So let's go to Leviticus chapter 23, starting in verse 10. And Yahweh says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give to you, and shall reap of its harvests, then you shall bring a sheaf, or an omer, of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest." So we look up this term sheaf in Strong's Hebrew Concordance, because that's one of the things we like to do. We find it's Strong's Old Testament 60:16. It's an omer, and it means a heap, or in other words, it means a sheaf. So basically what happens is when you're cutting the barley, you make a heap of the barley that you've cut, and when it reaches a certain size, you gather it up and wrap it with a cord, and this forms a sheaf. So the very first of those sheaves, and we're talking about for the nation, we are to then give to the priests, as it says in verse 11. It says, "He shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh." Notice it's a singular sheaf, not one for each household, but he shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Now, this is going to be the weekly Sabbath, and the rabbis do something else with their interpretation. But what we see here is that the term in Hebrew is mimaharet ha-Shabbat. So mimaharet simply means after, or the day after, and ha-Shabbat means the Shabbat. So when we're talking about mimaharet ha-Shabbat, we're talking about the day after the weekly Sabbath. And again, we'll see the rabbis do something else. They substitute the word Passover for Shabbat, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But here's a visual depiction. So now the Passover can fall any day during the week. It can fall on the first day, second day, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh days. Now, whichever day of the week the Passover falls on, we wait until the day after that weekly Sabbath. And that's when we offer the Omer, or the Wave Sheaf. And the offering of the Wave Sheaf begins what's called the Omer count. And the Omer count, again, always starts on the first day of the week, and the Sabbaths are always a multiple of 7. 7 weeks and 1 day later, that's when we reach the Pentecost. So we could take a look at this with some other examples. The same pattern is always going to hold true. So this is the year 2018, and if we take a look at the Passover for 2018, according to the Torah calendar, now again, the rabbis did something else, but on the Aviv barley calendar, the Passover was the first day of the week, and then the first day of unleavened bread began the next day, on the second day of the week. The second day of unleavened bread began on the third day of the week, the third day of unleavened on the fourth day of the week, etc., until we had the seventh day of unleavened bread taking place again on the first day of the week, and that's when the Omer was also offered, was on the first day of the week, because it was the first day of the week following the weekly Sabbath of the week during which the Passover fell. And then count 7 weeks and we reach the Pentecost. Let's take a look at some other examples. Let's take a look at the week of Yeshua's Passover sacrifice. Now we know that Yeshua was cut off. We know from Daniel, Yeshua was cut off in the middle of the week, but not for himself. And then he spent 3 days and 3 nights in the earth, according to the sign of the prophet Jonah. So then on the day after the weekly Sabbath of the week during which the Passover fell, that's when the Omer was offered. So we know that Yeshua was raised on the first day of the week because we read so in John chapter 20, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now the first day of the week, Miriam of Magdala, or Mary Magdalene, went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb." And we know that Yeshua is representative of each one of the festivals, including the Wave Sheaf offering. So we continue in verse 17. Yeshua said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. I haven't been presented yet." He says, "But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my Elohim and your Elohim." So again, Yeshua being representative of the Wave Sheaf, he still had to go and be presented to his Father, just like the priest would present the physical Wave Sheaf. And there's symbolic meaning in this too. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 20, where the apostle Shaul tells us that now Messiah is risen from the dead, and he has become the first fruits of those who've fallen asleep. And we'll see this term first fruits later, but that's basically what the Wave Sheaf offering is it's a first fruits of our barley. It's also a first fruits of anything edible in the nation, because in the ancient times, the barley was the first of the crops to come ripe. Now, it's very important understanding that the barley was the first of the crops to come ripe, because to give Yahweh the very first of that which he gives us, to give it back to him, not only does that show love, but it also shows trust and faith in him. So if we continue in Leviticus 23 and verse 14, Yahweh says, "You shall eat neither bread nor parched grain," and parching is a kind of roasting. "So you shall eat neither bread nor parched grain nor fresh grain until the same day that you have brought an offering to your Elohim. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations and in all your dwellings." So what that means is that no matter where we are, no matter where we dwell, we are supposed to bring Yahweh the very first of that which he gives us. And this, again, shows our love and our trust for him. So continuing in verse 15, he says, "And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath," meaning the day after the weekly Sabbath, "from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed," meaning we are to wait 7 weeks and a day, or to count 50 days. He continues. Verse 16, he says, count 50 days to the day after the seventh Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to Yahweh. So the rabbis do something else. They offer their Omer the day after the Pesach. And we'll show you why we believe that they do this. So we go to Joshua chapter 5 and verse 10. There's a special condition wherein the children of Israel experience the Passover on the Shabbat. So Joshua 5 and verse 10 says, now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. So it's correct. The Passover should be offered on the 14th day of the month. And then the Passover is offered between the evenings, so the first evening being noon, the second evening being sundown. So it's offered between the evenings, but it takes a while to dress it out and then cook it. So they would have enjoyed the Passover meal then on the evening starting the 15th day at twilight. So continuing to verse 11, it says, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. Now this is very important because Yahweh's just told us not to partake anything of the crops, the produce of the land, until after we've brought him an offering. So this is one of the ways that we know when the Passover was during the time of the conquest of the land of Canaan. If we take a look at the visual chart, we know that the Passover had to have been offered on the Sabbath, because the day after the Sabbath would be the day after the weekly Sabbath during which the Passover was offered. That would be the day of the Omer offering. It also would be the first day of unleavened bread. So this explains why the children of Israel ate both unleavened bread and parched grain on that same day, is because they were eating unleavened bread because of the days of unleavened bread, and they were able to eat parched is because they had already offered the Omer offering. So it's very interesting, though, just because the Passover can fall on the weekly Sabbath doesn't mean that we always should follow the rules for keeping the Passover on the weekly Sabbath. And in fact, the rabbis have an ancient saying, whoever's calendar you keep, that's who you worship. And this is a very interesting saying because the rabbis, again, they do something different than what Yahweh has commanded to be done. So effectively, they're keeping their own calendar, so to speak. Now, if we take a look at the way the rabbinics do this, and we cover this in more detail in the Torah calendar in the written study. So in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 15, Yahweh says, and you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath. And in the Hebrew, it's mimaharet ha-Shabbat, from the day after the Sabbath. Now they substitute in the word Passover there. It says, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Now notice what they've got here. They've got in the second line down, so mimaharet ha-Shabbat, they effectively translate that as mimaharet ha-Pesach. But then later, toward the second half of the verse, the word Sabbath is translated as Sabbath. So what they've got is a situation where in one part of the sentence, one part of verse 15, the Sabbath means Passover, and in the latter half, in the first half, Sabbath means Passover, and in the second half, Sabbath means Sabbath. So this doesn't work, but this is how the rabbis come up with their count, and this is a depiction of their count. So for example, on Yeshua's Passover sacrifice, the week of that sacrifice, the rabbis, and we know from Josephus and other things, we talk about this in the written study, the rabbis would offer the Wave Sheaf offering the very next day. So this gives us a situation where Yeshua is cut off in the middle of the week, and then he spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, but the Omer is offered the very next day. And simply mathematically, we know that this doesn't work because as we learn from Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40, Yeshua tells us, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So if we understand the Omer count, now let's take a brief look at the requirements for the Pentecost itself. So we go to Numbers chapter 28 and verse 26, and Yahweh says, "Also on the day of the first fruits, when you bring a new grain offering to Yahweh at your feast of weeks," and here he's talking about the Pentecost, or in Hebrew what's called Shavuot. He says, "You shall have a set-apart rehearsal. You shall do no customary work." So this is one of the three pilgrimage feasts, and we are to do no ordinary, no regular work on it, because these are days Yahweh wants us to focus and concentrate on being with him. So in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, Yahweh says, "You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain." So the putting the sickle to the grain, that's a reference to the Omer. And then, so here we have in this visual depiction, that's when we begin to put the sickle to the grain is the Omer, and then we count 7 weeks. And if we, depending on how we count, we add 7 weeks and come to the Pentecost, or 7 weeks in a day, but both bring us to the Pentecost. And again, the Omer and the Pentecost are both always fall on the first day of the week. So come to Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 10, Yahweh says, "Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot, to Yahweh your Elohim with the tribute of a freewill offering from your hand," remembering that this is one of the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals that in ancient Israel were used to bring the tithe up. He says, "Which you shall give as Yahweh your Elohim blesses you." Continuing on in verse 11, he says, "And you shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, at the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to make his name abide." And this is a great time of celebration, because even though it costs us of our time and of our money, and we have to do certain things, what a joy, what a treat, and what a pleasure it is to know that we are Yahweh's chosen people. Verse 12, he says, "And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe all of these statutes." So the house of Ephraim, or the Christian people, have gotten away from keeping Yahweh's statutes. And one of the things is that they have come to misunderstand some of the words of the apostle Shaul, or Paul. So we know from 2 Peter 3 and verses 15 through 17 that the words of the apostle Shaul are sometimes very difficult to understand. So if we take a closer look, though, at Shaul's words, we can understand what he is saying. So in Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 16, the apostle Shaul says, "Let no man therefore judge you." And this is the King James Version. Shaul says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moons or of the Sabbath days," the King James says. Now, the word days has been added. He says, "which are a shadow of the things to come, but the body is of Christ," or of Messiah. And again, the word is added here. However, this is a problem that these words have been added, because we're told in several places that we are not to add to Scripture. So, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2, Yahweh says, "You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I command you." And what he's really saying here is that if we modify Yahweh's commandments, such as the rabbis do with the timing of Rosh Hashanah and also the timing of the Omer and the Pentecost, we're not really keeping his commandments, but we're keeping our own version of his commandments. And this is why Solomon also says in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 6, he says, "Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar." So we don't want to add anything to his words. So where the King James translators have added these 2 words, days and is, we want to take those added words back out and see what difference it makes. So let's take a look at the King James corrected with the 2 added words taken out. And let's see if we can read closely and determine what Shaul is saying here. So Shaul says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moons, or of the Sabbath. He says, which are a shadow of things to come, meaning they're a prophetic shadow picture of coming things. He says, but the body of Messiah. But the body of Messiah what? Okay, so let's rearrange these. Let's take a look here. He's got three main ideas. So the first idea is, let no man therefore judge you in what you do regarding the feasts or the new moons or the Sabbath. He says, the second clause, he says, because these are prophetic shadow pictures of things that are still to come. And then he says, in the third clause, he says, but the body of Messiah. And again, but the body of Messiah what? So let's reorder these three clauses to make it read more smoothly. And what we see is what Shaul's actually telling us is, he says, let no man but the body of Messiah therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moons or of the Sabbath. He says, which are prophetic shadows of things still to come. In other words, and as we'll see from Shaul's example, not only were these things past fulfillments, not only were they fulfilled in the first century, but they're also going to be fulfilled in future times as well. So we know that the first Pentecost was fulfilled in the wilderness of Sinai, where Yahweh delivered the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments being more or less a codification of Yahweh's Spirit. And we know that the people agreed to this codification of Yahweh's Spirit, because in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 8, then all the people answered together and said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do, just like a bride saying her I do's in a marital covenant of sorts. But then we come to the first century, we come to Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Now remembering this is after Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. So the church hypothesis is that Yeshua's sacrifice on the cross or the stake or tree or whatever you want to call it, that Yeshua's sacrifice did away with all of the Old Testament festivals. But we know this isn't the case because in Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 1, we're told, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place, and that one place was probably the temple courtyard. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the set-apart Spirit, and began to speak with other tongues, as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now, it's very important and symbolic that Yahweh gave a codification of his Spirit in the day of Pentecost in the wilderness. Here in Acts chapter 2, after Yeshua's arrival, he's actually giving the gift of his Spirit. Now, the gift of the Spirit had been given before, but this was the first time it had been poured out en masse to a very large group of people. And if we want to read more about that, about the gift of speaking in tongues, I would encourage you to read Nazarene Scripture Studies Volume 1, where we talk about speaking in tongues. And again, you can get that on the NazareneIsrael.org website or from Amazon.com. But we know that the apostles continued to practice the days of the festivals that Yahweh gave, the original 7 festivals. Because, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 8, the apostle Shaul tells us, he says, but I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost. So the apostle Shaul is still keeping the Pentecost, and we know that this is the Pentecost on the Jerusalem calendar and not on the Roman calendar because of Acts chapter 20 and verse 16, where we read that Shaul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of the Pentecost. So again, we know that the Pentecost was still important to them in the first century. And so we've seen that the Yahweh tells us to keep his festivals always. We've seen that there was a fulfillment at Mount Sinai in what might be called the Old Testament or the Tanakh period. We saw that it was fulfilled in Acts chapter 2 in the renewed covenant period after Yeshua's resurrection. And we're also going to see that it's going to be fulfilled again in the future by the 144,000. So in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 4, it tells us that these, referring to the 144,000, are the ones who are not defiled with women, for they are virgins. And these are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to Elohim and to the Lamb. So if we want to be firstfruits unto him, then we need to be keeping the Feast of Firstfruits, because these things are set apart rehearsals. And this is also why in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 22, Shaul tells us, for as in Adam, all die, even so in Mashiach, or Messiah, all shall be made alive. But each one in his own order. Messiah, the firstfruits, first, and then afterward, those who are Messiahs at his coming. And again, if we seek to be Messiahs, then we ought to keep his festival days. If you'd like to know more about the Torah calendar, I encourage you to go to NazareneIsrael.org and download a copy of the Torah calendar, or you can read it free online, or you can purchase a copy at Amazon.com at our cost. So please join us again, and please check out the free studies that are available at NazareneIsrael.org. Shalom.